Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to deliver the Ministerial report on public housing reform in the Northern Territory, which was notified on Wednesday the 19th of March. I move that the report be noted. Madam Speaker, one of our key focuses this year is public housing reform. Public housing is essential. It provides safe, affordable homes for low-income and vulnerable individuals and families right across the Territory. It helps reduce homelessness, supports economic participation and ensures access to essential services. What has happened over the last 8 years is the erosion of acceptable behaviour in public housing, a loosening of holding tenants to account and adherence to policies, plans and procedures that have become outdated. It is no secret that antisocial behaviour and serious incidents of crime in public housing have risen to an unacceptable level, as has the level of rent arrears. Madam Speaker, we are fully aware of what is going on and are focused on dealing with the root causes of crime when it comes to public housing and crime around the Territory. But firstly, I want to tell you a story. It's not a children's fairy tale, but a factual account. The inaction towards antisocial behaviour can be traced back to the wishy-washy philosophical ideology left behind by Labor to water down accountability. Under Labor's 8-year term, there was a serious lack of consequences. Public housing tenants who caused repeated disturbances, threatened their neighbours, threatened each other and blatantly disregarded community standards with drunken screaming and yelling and fighting were allowed to remain in public housing with little to no repercussions. You have heard me talk in this House before about the tenants with 62 red card demerit points as an example. A total of 203 reports of antisocial behaviour were recorded for a previous tenancy they held. Rather than being held accountable, they were relocated to a 3-bedroom house in May 2024. Since then, Madam Speaker, 158 reports of antisocial behaviour have been recorded at that particular tenancy. How is this fair to the decent, hard-working families and pensioners on the public housing waitlist? It's not fair. Residents from a suburb in the Greater Darwin region submitted a petition to the former Labor Housing Minister in June 2019 complaining of parties, drunken behaviour, fights and threats of violence to those neighbours. The tenant was moved to another property where similar behaviour continued. Neighbours reported not feeling safe in their very own home, living in fear and an inability to go to work or take their children to school due to a lack of sleep. One tenant was moved 3 times with taxpayers footing a bill of nearly $83,000 on transfers and modifications to properties, and yet another refused to relocate from a property despite it being deemed unsafe. Meanwhile, the percentage of complaints where antisocial behaviour was substantiated dropped by more than half, from 48% in 2019-2020 to just 22% in 2022 and 23. These case histories and statistics are just the tip of the iceberg. Law-abiding Territorians have been forced to endure neighbours from hell, while the system under Labor bent over backwards to accommodate those who repeatedly broke the rules. Another rule that has been repeatedly broken is paying rent. The current state of rental arrears across the Northern Territory public housing portfolio, as I mentioned earlier this week, is absolutely appalling. I'll recap. On the 7th of December 2021, Cabinet, at the time, under Labor, considered the submission of the Remote Public Housing Rental Framework and approved a policy position to waive the entire remote rent debt balance of $69.71 million. The waiver was on the basis that it was considered irrecoverable. In just the 2.5 years since that write-off, housing is now carrying an accumulated rental arrears debt of over $39 million. I repeat, rental arrears has now accumulated to $39 million. An astonishing 1,422 tenancies across the full urban Northern Territory social housing portfolio currently have accumulated debt of over $10,000. The highest is $40,000, followed by a couple at $36,000, another at $34,000, there's one at $39,000. I stopped asking after that. 1,422 tenancies have an accumulated debt of over $10,000. This is clearly unacceptable. What I haven't stopped asking since then is what could have some of this recovered money delivered to improve the lives of so many Territorians? Unacceptably, all of this happened while there has been an 8 to 10 year wait list for public housing here in the Northern Territory. It's been a never-ending story, this compassion without consequences approach left behind by Labor. The CLP has said 2025 will be a year of action, certainty and security, and this includes making public housing safer and more secure. We are putting a stop to 8 years of Labor inaction. There will be no more slaps on the wrist, no more sympathy without safeguards. Already there has been an increase in substantiations of antisocial behaviour. From the 1st of July 2024 to 31 December 2024, there were 5,060 reports of antisocial behaviour across the Northern Territory, of which 1,081 were substantiated, an increase of 844 reports and 451 substantiations when compared to the previous reporting period. Madam Speaker, we appreciate some public housing tenants are vulnerable due to mental health issues and domestic violence incidents, and we are not about to turf people onto the streets. But there needs to be more balance. The scales need to be tipped back towards individual accountability and responsibility for the well-being of all Territorians and security and safety of communities. Our action plan for public housing reform includes strengthening policy to fast-track the pathways to eviction, full review of the visitor management, tenancy management and red card policy, debt management policy reform, review of the Housing Act 1982 to align with community expectations. We will be making recommendations to the Attorney-General's Office for changes to the Residential Tenancies Act to also align with community expectations. Public housing reform will empower our staff to refine processes to deal with antisocial behaviour and tenancy termination, ensuring these matters are well prepared, supported by strong evidence and aligned with legislative requirements. Our reform includes short and long-term measures over the next 6 to 9 months. Strengthening the red card policy to align accountability for excessive rent debts, untidy yards, property damage and ongoing antisocial behaviour. Madam Speaker, strengthening the capacity of the CEO in housing to deal with multiple and serious breaches of tenancy agreements swiftly. Updating the termination of tenancy policy, including requiring tenants with ongoing antisocial behaviour issues to undertake supported accommodation programs and provide at least 2 rental references to determine they had passed programs such as the ability to sustain a tenancy and manage visitors prior to regaining eligibility for public housing. Updating the tenant damage policy to implement processes to effectively deal with tenants who are damaging or failing to maintain public housing properties. Review of the Department's tenancy agreement policy to implement a structured leasing model aligned to interstate jurisdictions, rather than the current automatic lapse from a 6-month to a periodic agreement. Examples include an initial 6-month probationary agreement, then a 1 to 2 year lease agreement, and then a graduation to a 5 to 10 year agreement. We'll be reviewing transferring tenants with demonstrated antisocial behaviour to consider termination for tenancies with ongoing antisocial behaviour. Transferring tenants is not an option. In addition to the use of acceptable behaviour agreements and the red card demerit point system, we will introduce statutory breach notices where tenants are required to maintain a period of compliance and not breach their tenancy agreement. Streamlining and strengthening policy to fast-track the pathways to eviction. Cases before the Northern Territory Civil and Administrative Tribunal, commonly known as NTCAT, can take from 6 months to a year with the option of appeals. Ensuring that all required information is gathered before submission is critical to preventing delays in the NTCAT process and improving the likelihood of successful outcomes. Madam Speaker, we are reviewing the tenancy management policy and visitor management policy to empower our outstanding frontline housing staff. Priorities include additional clauses to the standard tenancy agreement that requires a tenant to engage with support services due to antisocial behaviour, failure to maintain, rent arrears, and if not, it can be considered as a breach of the tenancy agreement and action taken. Reinforcement of a tenant's accountability for managing their visitors and consider action that can be taken for unapproved visitors. Updating the complaints policy and processes to introduce a minimum threshold for investigation and confirm a zero-tolerance approach to staff abuse by tenants. Amending the extended absence policy to prevent longer-term incarcerated tenants from retaining their tenancy and ensuring that tenants approved for extended absences must maintain the condition of the property in their absence. Working with the Fines Recovery Unit and the Northern Territory Police to develop procedures to support public housing safety officers to use their legislated powers to issue and enforce infringements to tenants engaging in antisocial behaviour and other prescribed offences on public housing premises. Working with Licensing NT to seek approval from the Registrar to deem the common areas of public housing complexes with ongoing antisocial behaviour issues as alcohol-restricted premises without the requirement to gain majority tenant agreement. Update signage on the common areas of public housing complexes to advise that trespassing is prohibited so that public housing safety officers can issue notices of direction to trespassers in line with their powers to act, including the Trespass Act and the Housing Act 1982. We are working on developing a memorandum of understanding with the NT Police and the Department of Children and Families to improve the complaints, mandatory reporting processes and compliance activities. We will explore options for a joint complaints process that prevents the requirement for complainants to report antisocial behaviour, criminal behaviour and child safety concerns to 3 separate departments. This process needs to be streamlined. We will be putting greater accountability onto tenants to ensure rent is paid or rental arrears are at least diligently pursued. Current policy allows a person to apply for housing with no limit to the debt and does not specify a debt amount that triggers the CEO to review the debt. The debt management policy states that the policy detail, a client with a debt must be making repayments on the debt before the housing assistance will be provided. However, without further stipulation, this allows a new tenant to set up an agreement to pay the week after allocation and cancel several weeks in. Our proposed actions include a client with previous debt must sign an agreement to pay, if not existing at the time of submitting their application. An application would not be approved if the agreement to pay defaults before assessment and approval. An applicant must have paid a minimum 30% of their debt prior to being offered housing and cannot have more than $1,500 in debt at the time of allocation. We will review debt exceeding $1,500 and seek termination for rent debt of $5,000 or more if there is ongoing non-payment of rent and debts. We will review the threshold of rental arrears when tenancies are referred to housing compliance to issue a notice to remedy, currently set at $21 days rental arrears. Debt validation process review, including training for relevant staff to provide a clear expectation of applicants and tenants who owe debt to the department. There will be a review of compliance processes to ensure a streamlined pathway to issue a notice of remedy or lodge an initiating application with NTCAT. Finally, we are reviewing the Housing Act 1982 and seeking recommendations from the Attorney-General's Office for the Residential Tenancies Act 1999 to both strengthen and align with community expectations. Madam Speaker, one proposal under consideration is increasing the powers of public housing safety officers, which I've previously mentioned. These provisions sit under the Housing Act 1982. It is recommended they are provided with similar powers of transit safety officers under the Public Transport Passenger Safety Act clauses 26, 27 capital A, 27 capital B, 27 capital C and section 28. Madam Speaker, we also want to determine if public housing safety officers can have increased powers to issue banned drinker orders in line with the NT Police. Madam Speaker, in summary, we will ensure legislation and public housing policies are tightened and enforced properly, and we will be backing our hard-working staff 100%. We will not expect them to turn a blind eye to unacceptable behaviour, but will take into account the required training and additional resources needed to carry out this important work. Our housing staff are out there to ensure compliance. They are not meant to be doubling up as social workers. Some of these changes will occur within 6 months, others may require a little longer. The important thing, Madam Speaker, is we are taking action. Antisocial behaviour, serious incidents of crime, rental arrears in public housing have been allowed to spiral out of control for far too long. The time for excuses and rolling out the red carpet for repeat offenders is over. There'll be no more compassion without consequences. There'll be no more slaps on the wrist, no more putting up with tenants that are disturbing their neighbours, committing offences, committing antisocial behaviour, playing music to all hours of the day and night, keeping hard-working people up at night, preventing children from getting the sleep that they need to go to school. Enough is enough, Madam Speaker. I've travelled the Territory now. I've travelled through Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, Katherine, the Greater Darwin region, and it's of great concern to me the amount of complaints that I hear about antisocial behaviour in public houses and in public unit complexes. I do want to reiterate there are many good tenants out there. We need to keep that in mind, that there are many, many good public housing tenants out there. But we can no longer allow those that want to disrupt the privacy, the safety and security of others in neighbourhoods throughout the Northern Territory. We will rein in the debt and we will take action to ensure that the antisocial behaviour is dealt with swiftly and in accordance with new policy and legislation. Thank you, Madam Speaker.